Here in Chapter 6, we're going to take a look at some of the ways that we can make mistakes in thinking, and we're going to focus a little bit on attention, perception, and memory. Some interesting things. There is a case study in the last part of the chapter that I encourage you to read. It kind of goes over some of the aspects we're going to talk about in this chapter and in a practical case, but we're not going to go over that during this lecture. I encourage you to read through it if you'd like to, but we're going to look at the nuts and bolts here, and you can practice the practical aspect by looking at that reading case study in the back of the chapter on eyewitness testimony. So in this chapter, we're going to take a look at some of the cognitive errors that are associated with attention, perception, and memory. We're going to look at some examples on how cognitive errors will impair critical thinking. There are a lot from the book, and we'll talk about some more different ones as we go through the chapter too. There will be a discussion that you can read about eyewitness testimony and its accuracy, and we're going to look at how we use or how we avoid thinking errors and use knowledge of attention, perception, and memory when we talk about a well-reasoned inductive conclusion. And then you can apply that to that case if you so choose to look at that. We'll talk about some other things during this lecture, and you'll have different things to talk about either in class or during a discussion board. So starting out with a what do you think? When you look at something, we always see it. Sounds like an odd thing to think of, but what happens when we look at something, there are different aspects of our psyche that are involved. And it starts with sensation, the thing that we sense, it's coming into our eyes. Then we perceive it. What kind of image does our brain create based on what we see? And then we also have some kind of memory thing. How does that thing fit into my memory? So if I look at a picture on the wall and I know the person, I will perceive, or excuse me, I will sense that there's a picture on the wall. The light will reflect off of it into my eyes, and my eyes will have these photoreceptors that turn on and off depending on the color and the light and things like that. And then it will send that image onto my brain, and my brain will make sense of that image, and then I will know, oh, okay, that's a picture of somebody that I know, and then my memory will have some kind of influence on what I see based on the schema that I have of it, based on what that picture means to me. And then that composite of my sensing and my perceiving and my making sense of it with my long-term memory will create this overall image that is that thing on the wall. Now, if I look at it again, I might think differently. If I'm in a different mood, I might see it differently, which is interesting to think of because it's the same thing on the wall, but I see it differently. But if I look at a picture on the wall that doesn't mean a lot to me, I'll still sense it. I'll still see something. My brain will make a picture out of it, and then I will perceive it, and then my long-term memory may or may not have anything to do with it. And if it doesn't have anything to do with it, like if I've never seen that picture before, I have to look at all the itty-bitty details, so I kind of have to be more intentional about that thing. And then the next time I look at it, I might miss something. Because now that I don't look as hard at that image because I've seen it before, I don't pay attention to the little things, and I might miss something. We do this a lot, especially with reading, by the way. There are lots of little experiments and tricks that you can do to outline that. But the very first thing that we're looking at in this chapter is something that we take for granted, that we always see the same thing, but the reality is that we don't always see the same thing. Number 2, is there something wrong with the person who hallucinates? That's an interesting thing. Is there something wrong with them? Can it happen to you? Do you have to be on drugs? There are lots of different ideas that go into how we hallucinate and what those hallucinations might mean. Okay. 3, how do magicians, I almost said musicians, well, musicians are good too, but how do magicians accomplish their amazing feats? We're all seeing something. We see something that is apparently impossible. How do they do that? Okay. Boop. Is your memory like a video recorder that stores an exact copy of whatever you observe? Right. So if you look at something, does it just stay there forever? Okay. And then last is eyewitness testimony accurate, and should jurors trust it? Again, we've talked about different ways of knowing, and one of them is what you observe. And is your empirical observation enough? Is anecdote enough? So we have to think about, should we trust eyewitness testimony, or does it need to be something else? And again, that case, if you choose to read it, will outline some of the issues that go into eyewitness testimony and whether or not it's trustworthy. And to what degree it's trustworthy. It's not is it trustworthy or not, it's to what degree is it. I should have made it sound so black and white. Okay, so cognitive errors in critical thinking. So one of the big issues in critical thinking is called cognitive errors. And usually what this is if we're not aware of the way that we can make mistakes, we will accidentally make mistakes and not know it. Okay. It's kind of scary in that way because we think, oh, well, how do I know if I'm making a mistake if I don't know I'm making a mistake? Well, you don't, unless you're trained to think about it and to be aware. So the first step in becoming aware of cognitive errors is recognizing that people have cognitive errors. So cognitive error is some kind of problem with our thinking or processing. So whether it's through attention, perception, learning, memory, and thought, we have to be aware that there are ways that we can erroneously process information. So when we think of attention, when we think of perception, it's what are we looking at? What are we paying attention to? What are we giving our attention to? How do we perceive these things? How do we learn? In what way do we retrieve things that we've learned? So if we're talking about recall from our memory, so when we have to process all the information that we have to recognize that even if we did it with a success rate of 99%, every so often we're going to make a mistake. And sometimes they are mistakes that don't make a big difference, and sometimes they are mistakes that make a big difference. All right, so if you're going to the grocery store and you couldn't remember if you needed a half a gallon of milk or a gallon of milk and you bought a half a gallon, probably not a big deal. But if you are thinking about buying orange juice and you can't remember if you're supposed to buy orange juice or orange soda, like Crush, right? And you bought Orange Crush thinking that you got the right one, and you brought it home and somebody wants to make breakfast, okay, all of a sudden. All right, so when we are aware of cognitive errors, then we have to also think about them in terms of reasoning. So if we are trying to make some kind of reasoned argument or reasoned thought, then we have to be aware of the level of cognitive error that we have when we're making that reasoned thought. When we have any error in attention, perception, and memory, that affects reasoning. And the problem with that is that, again, we're oftentimes not aware of it. Or if we are aware of it, we try to rationalize it somehow. It's like, well, how am I making this mistake? And oftentimes we won't think about what we're doing to make the mistake. We will make our mistake make sense in the world. And we'll talk about a lot of examples of how we try to make our mistakes make sense in the world. So when we think of the consequences of cognitive errors, we're kind of drawn to this example of eyewitness testimony. Because eyewitness testimony is tricky because people are usually recalling what happened during a stressful or peculiar time, and they may not always have the best memory because there are other biopsychological events happening at the same time as trying to process these memories. You have adrenaline, and we can stop at talking about adrenaline because adrenaline causes lots of cognitive issues only because it is a way to direct attention from the brain to the body so that you can prepare for fight or flight. So if you have this kind of autonomic arousal, typically you're not thinking as clearly, so you may not perceive things and process information as clearly as you'd like to, which is why we always talk about, if you're a police officer training for these scenarios, that way you can stay inside of your head and not be susceptible to some of the other issues that go along with being an autonomic arousal and not being able to think clearly because your body's preparing for fight or flight. So these cognitive errors obviously have big consequences in those cases. And what happens is that when we are processing a case, the jurors rely on eyewitness testimony. We're always calling witnesses to the stand, and we're trying to determine if what the witnesses are saying are valid issues, or if they are things that might be biased. So not only are the jurors trying to figure out if what somebody's saying is true, but also if what they're saying is biased in a way that the witness themselves may not be aware of. So it gets tricky when we talk about cognitive errors and the way that eyewitness testimony is reliant on those eyewitness testimonies. How do we get around that? Well, that's even trickier, because you have to be aware of these things, and not everybody is taking a class in critical thinking. So people will kind of pick up what they can along the way, but people oftentimes don't seek out ways to learn more about critical thinking because it's a hassle. People don't have time to do that, and people don't want to think, well, at worst, people don't want to think that they have something wrong with the way that they think. At best, people just aren't aware that there are different ways to think than the way they already think. Okay. So again, we're going to focus on three main ways that we can have cognitive errors. One is through attention, which is how we divide our focus onto things. Perception, which is about the way that we collect information and organize and interpret it. So perception is very interesting in that it's not just about what you see, it's about what sense you make of it. And we'll talk about illusions and hallucinations and how those are types of perceptions. And then memory, which is learning and remembering, and also recalling. So we can remember things, we can recall things. We can also recognize things. There's a really good study, and we won't go into it in this class, but there's a really interesting study that talks about the difference between recalling information and how we can recognize things at a greater rate than we can recall them. So let's start with areas of attention. And again, attention is how we can direct our minds to different stimuli. This also includes focus, being able to focus on something, maintaining alertness of something, and that's maintaining alertness of something that they're trying to look out for, like if you're trying to look to see if the light turns green at the stoplight, but also to be alert of things that are out of the ordinary or different. So if you're trying to look for somebody in a long line of people and you're a TSA agent, then you will look for things that are out of the ordinary. The one basic assumption that we have of our attention, that it's limited, and it really is limited. We can get distracted easily. It's not that difficult. We can have things that misdirect us. So we have to think of attention as kind of this tenuous skill that we have, and it's not always reasonable for us to maintain our attention even when we're trying to. One of the classic examples of this is when we misdiagnose children with having ADHD. Usually what happens is that you have this third grade teacher who says, well, Johnny doesn't pay attention to what we're doing in class. He's always looking at other things or wants to play with things around the room or whatever. And then you walk into a third grade classroom and, well, yeah, Johnny's going to be distracted. Every kid's going to be distracted in that room because there's lots of cool stuff to look at. There's things to play with, and you're asking them to pay attention to you. Maybe at the head of the room talking about, whatever you're talking about, or even trying to engage in, group work or small burst activities or something. It's very difficult to pay attention because your attention span is limited and they want to look around. And also one of the misnomers of attention deficit disorder is that you're really not inattentive necessarily. It's that you pay attention to everything. And when you don't pay attention to the things that somebody wants you to pay attention to, they label you as inattentive. Isn't that nice? Now, there are real cases of ADHD. I'm not saying that there isn't, but lots of times we'll misdiagnose it because children are overstimulated and they're trying to take in their surroundings, and then they get labeled a certain way. Okay, so this link is available to you on the PowerPoint. So please refer to that PowerPoint attached or in the same content area as this video lecture. I can't play the video because whenever I try to play videos from YouTube, I get a copyright claim, and I can't actually produce these videos if I get a copyright claim. So you'll have to take a look at this. Hopefully you don't have to type in every character in this. You can just go to the link in the PowerPoint that's attached to the content area where this video lecture lives. So please follow along and try to pay attention to this. It's a really cool study. It's been redone a lot of times, but it's a cool one. So take a look at it and see what you think. Now that you watched an example of this, what you saw was called inattentional blindness. It's when you are paying attention to some aspect of your perceptual field and missing something else that is usually pretty obvious. Inattentional blindness can be as innocent as missing somebody who is raising their hand. Sometimes it can be really important when you don't see the stoplight because you're texting on your phone or because you're daydreaming or whatever it is. These are examples of when we just don't have adequate attention. And what happens is that people overestimate the amount of attention that they can provide when they are distracted by other things. So even when you're paying attention to something, it's hard enough to notice everything that you need to. But if you're distracted, it's even easier to forget, not to forget, but to not pay attention, which is why we're not supposed to text while we drive, no matter how good we think we are at it. There's about a 10 times increase in likelihood of there being an accident when somebody is texting versus when they're not, no matter how good you think you are at it. You are not paying attention to what you need to. What happens is that we just don't pay attention to things in every moment that we are looking at something that we are focusing on. So we overestimate the amount of multitasking that we can do. And what's interesting about that is that with multitasking, there really isn't a number of things that you can do simultaneously accurately. What we do call that is called switch tasking. So you switch back and forth rapidly between things. Like when you are texting on your phone, every single bit of your attention in that moment is on your phone. Maybe you're listening for things, but in the moment that you hear something, you stop paying attention to your phone. All right, so there are stimuli that can come into through your senses that will redirect your attention, but you are switching back and forth very quickly. And we've kind of done this before. You kind of look at your phone, you look up the road, you're like, I'm not sure how long I was just looking at my phone for. It probably wasn't a long time, but it was long enough to where you weren't looking at the road for 2 or 3 seconds, which is a lot, right? You can travel like 150 feet in 3 seconds if you're traveling at a decent rate of speed. So this inattentional blindness is problematic because we think that we won't fall prey to it. We think that we won't fall prey to it, but we do. What can also happen is misdirection, and magicians do this all the time. They're trying to, make something disappear. They will redirect your attention to something else, which is why, magicians always have lovely assistants and things like that. And you pay attention to flashy things and smoke and mirrors and everything, and that's misdirection to make sure you don't look at what you would otherwise notice is the trick. All right, so that's not unlike what happens to us in everyday life, in that we get misdirected by things, right? You're paying attention to something, you hear a bird chirp or a horn honk or whatever. Athletes are really notorious for being bothered by misdirection. So if you are we've seen professional athletes do this. You're playing in the big game and it's really loud in the stadium and they can't concentrate. And you, like in a football game, you might see a quarterback kind of step back from the center and kind of wave to the crowd to quiet down so they can hear and everything. It's misdirection. Yeah, you need to hear the commands, but you're also not able to focus on things if you're distracted by the loud noise and everything. You're taking an exam and somebody's phone goes off. You're misdirected. In that moment, you're kind of pulled out of your zone, and you aren't able to get back into it because you got misdirected by something. So this is kind of a real-life application of this inattentional blindness because you aren't able to focus on something because something else is happening. So in that moment, you're experiencing inattentional blindness. You can't not pay attention to this thing like a phone going off, and that's causing you to not pay attention to the focus that you had on the quiz. So it's kind of one of these small examples, but it's pervasive in our lives. So here's an example of change blindness. Again, please follow this YouTube link on the PowerPoint presentation. Change blindness is a little bit different than inattentional blindness, where there's something that changes and you may not recognize it. So take a look at that clip and and think to yourself, would I notice this? And now that you're back, let's take a look at change blindness, which is a curious thing. So we know that that with change blindness, it's when you don't pay attention to something that changes from moment to moment. An example of this might be something like when you go to the drive-through, and you're at the window and somebody takes your credit card and runs it, and then somebody different brings you your food. Lots of times you'll probably notice it, but every so often you probably wouldn't notice it, especially if the workers look the same or sound the same. If you're not paying a lot of attention to it, you may not notice it. So we have this change blindness, and a lot of people won't recognize that it's happening. But what happens too is that people overestimate the amount of change blindness that they have, and it's mostly because we don't want to think that we're getting duped or anything. So we think, oh, I'm not gonna fall prey to change blindness. Well, there have been several studies that have found that people have what's called change blindness. They are not even aware that they experience change blindness, so that they would have change blindness. Okay? So this is an overconfidence issue. This is a meta cognitive thought error where we think that we won't fall prey to something, but we do. Again, we don't want to seem like we're susceptible to these things, but one of the better things to do in order to grow your critical thinking skills is to recognize that you have these issues that you can work on. We all do. I mean, even after you learn about change blindness, you will have change blindness because we aren't ever sure what the limits of our cognitive errors are. So we like to think that once we've learned about something, we won't ever experience it again. Well, guess what? You will, and that's okay. Nothing wrong with it. It's okay. And then again, divided attention, multitasking, also called switch tasking. We talked a little bit about this earlier. But when we distribute resources between more than one task, that we're prone to error, and we are a lot less efficient than when we focus on one task. People like to say that, I'm a good multitasker. Nobody's a good multitasker. What you probably mean is that you can handle multiple things at once because you're good at switching back and forth quickly. And even then, you're not as efficient at either one as you would be if you were just doing one thing and sticking with it. Again, that doesn't mean that that's always going to be the reasonable thing to do, because you're always asked to do multiple things at once. Ask any parent, they'll tell you. So the example that the text provides is that when you're talking on the phone or texting while driving, that's divided attention or switch tasking. You can't do either very effectively, and all of a sudden you aren't able to focus on the road, or you're ignoring the person on the phone or whatever. Another thing that happens that's kind of along the same lines as multitasking is, you have your radio cranked up. And then radio cranked up. Does anybody call it a radio? Because that suggests that we're listening to like FM, AM radio. When you have the sound in your car turned way up, and you're driving down the highway, everything's good. But when you get off the highway and then you're looking for something, you turn your radio down. Why? Because it's divided attention. We need to focus on finding something with our eyes, even though our eyes and our ears don't have a lot to do with each other in terms of what they're processing. We still turn it down because we're getting distracted by the loudness, at the very least, of the music. So we have to kind of turn our music down so we can see better. It's an odd thing to say, but that's how it works. Now, once we're aware of errors of attention, we can move on to errors of perception, because perception is what we make sense of when information comes in through our five senses. So our brain tries to perceive or make sense of what we experience. So again, perception is taking in data through the senses, and the book likes to say it organizes the data. Data is information, right? So it organizes the information that comes in, tries to recognize patterns, because that's a nice heuristic in order to be able to store information and to make sense of it, and then interpret the information. What things mean. When you see the color red, it means something to you. When you see a picture of somebody, it means something to you. When you hear a certain sound, it means something. When you're reading a book and a book is describing a smell, it means something to you, which is, by the way, one of the best ways to convey meaning through text is by talking about a smell. It's kind of one of those fun things. And it's kind of curious, the olfactory gland, where your smell is perceived in your brain is very near to your frontal cortex, where you kind of like have these collected memories that you make sense of in conscious ways. So it's very curious that those things are so close to each other, and smell tends to be the best way to talk about some kind of sense through text. Anyways, perception is when we make sense of what we sense. Okay? Perception, there are lots of really cool examples of perception we could get into. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, we just can't. But there are times when we can perceive things differently than when we sense them. Very, very, very interesting cases. One of them, if you want to look them up, is called blind sight, where somebody can perceive a stimulus that they can't have a mental representation of. Boy, how do you describe it? Go to YouTube and look at a video on the concept of blind sight. There are some good versions of that. But again, blind sight is where the person is functionally blind. They can't see something. They don't have a mental image of something, but they know that it's there. And there are experiments that have been set up to reflect blind sight in sighted people. It's a really cool phenomenon. But there are some faulty ways of perceiving, and when we talk about blind sight, it's probably one of the most extreme versions of that. But our perception has limits, and we kind of know that because there are animals that can hear different frequencies than us. There are other animals that can perceive different light spectrums than we can. So we know that there are limits to our own perception just based on that alone, but also because we have instrumentation that's available, a scientific instrumentation that allows us to see better, to hear better, to sense something. And so we know that humans have limits to that. One of the examples in the book is the ability for us to see stars in the sky. But if you use a pair of binoculars to look in the sky, you can see more stars. So just using something like a set of binoculars that most people have around could increase our senses, and which again suggests that we have these limits in perception. So let's take a look at some of these. I have some links here that I can go to because these are not YouTube links that I'm going to get copyright claimed on. So let me follow these, and we'll see what they show us. This is a tone generator, and unfortunately I can't do the sound on this right now, but what I want you to do is go to this tone generator, and you can just go to the web link. I can drag this down real quick. The web link is right there. szynalski.com/tone-generator/ and that will get you there. You can also click the link on the PowerPoint. But what this will show you, and if you use headphones, that's kind of the better way to do it, is that we have a range of hearing that we have on the low end and on the high end. And the thing about this is that even though you can't hear tones above 20,000, you will hear some kind of odd tone that is a function of your audio card trying to make sense of the input that's coming in. It's a rectified sound, and it isn't actually there, but it's the best you can do without getting an actual tone generator. But you can kind of mess around and see where your tone starts to go out when you can't hear it anymore. Generally, the older you are, the less high pitch you can hear. You can usually go down to about 10 to 15 hertz. Below that, you can't. If you have a good set, that's kind of cool. If you have a good set of noise canceling headphones and you bring this down to like 15 or so, you'll be able to actually almost count the number of times that your headphones pulse per second. A hertz is a number of cycles per second. So what this means is that you're hearing a sound wave every 15 times a second. So imagine if you were tapping your fingers on your desk and you could do 15 times a second, which is, you could probably get like 8 or 10, I'd imagine. If you're really quick, maybe you could get 15 per second. If you're a drummer and you subdivide 16th notes into a bar, that should be good enough. But this will kind of give you an idea of some of the limits that we have to hearing. Again, the ranges are about 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz in normal humans. 20,000 hertz is pretty tough to hear. 25,000 plus is not. We don't have that ability in human hearing. Other animals like dogs do. So if you're a younger person, you can probably hear those 20 kilohertz values, but there is a limit to that and to what you can hear. Sometimes people will think that animals can predict things like storms and things like that, and the reason why we think that is because we can't hear distant thunder and stuff like that, but other animals can. So they will respond to a thunderstorm coming, minutes before we do, and we'll think that they have some kind of sixth sense. No, what they have is more ability to perceive that stimulus than we do. That's the big difference. And again, humans artificially will increase the ability to perceive by using different instruments like telescopes, microscopes, microphones, et cetera, et cetera. Things like seismographs too for sensing vibrations. So if you want to hear or feel, which by the way are the same thing when you're talking about vibrations. If you want to hear or feel a vibration that is very, very subtle, you'd need a seismograph, something that will detect things like earthquakes. But you can also use it for any other kind of sound resonance. When industrial corporations are looking for oil and water, they'll use seismographs. They'll send a signal down, then they'll listen for it. Ultrasound is kind of the same way. You send out a signal, and the way that it reflects back will indicate the shape or density of something. Lots of fun ways that we can increase our sensory perceptual limits. This is an example from the book. It's a Stop and Think, but it's about visual perception. And when we look at these three lines, we can see that even though the first line doesn't have conventional letters, we still make sense of it, even though the A in can, the symbols that make up the A in can, look like the symbols that make up the H in this. And why can we recognize these patterns? Because we don't read word for word. We look at shapes of words. Even when the letters are out of order, we can reasonably read them well. It's trickier when the letters in the first and last positions are not where they're supposed to be, kind of like in the last example. But generally, we can look at different violations of written language and recognize what is intended by the writer despite what it actually looks like. And that's because we take shortcuts, right? So when we have something that we perceive, we make sense of it. Our brains make sense of it. If this were just a matter of of sensation, we wouldn't be able to read this because that is not a letter A. But because they look close enough, there's kind of like this continuity thing that's going on here. We recognize it. And we also recognize that in the case of this, we have an ambiguous symbol. It could be perceived as an H or an A, but because we have the T and the I and the S, the missing letter really only has one option, and it's not A. So our brains will make sense of that. Same thing as this one. So where we have both typos and omissions and different font variants, we still will recognize what that says because our brains make sense of it. It is harder now in the third example, in example C, because the first and last letters of the last two words are not in the right places. If those were in the right place, but all the other letters were juxtaposed, we wouldn't be able to read it, we wouldn't have any issues reading it because our brains can make sense of the first and last letters, which is what we first look at in a word, and then the shape of the word itself. The nice thing about perception is that we can rely on context in order to make sense of things. Generally, this is very helpful to have a context because we don't have to think about making decisions as much. We can do things quicker. We can use cognitive shortcuts. For example, if you walk into a pizza place, you don't have to think about, oh, am I going to have a hamburger or the lobster? Because those aren't options at a pizza place. The context matters. I mean, you go to one of these hipster pizza places, you could probably have a lobster pizza, I guess. But that's not the point here. We can improve our perception by relying on what's going around us in order to make a decision or to make sense of what we are perceiving. The example from the book uses different objects that might be found in a kitchen, that might be found outdoors or whatever. And then what happens is the authors suggest that, if we have somebody look at a picture of a kitchen, and then we show them some objects like a drum, or we have them look at a loaf of bread or an open mailbox, they will be able to identify a loaf of bread quicker if they've been looking at the context that it belongs in, like a kitchen. And I know it seems interesting. It's like, well, wait a second. How long does it take to recognize a loaf of bread? Well, when we measure differences, we're able to see a difference in the time it takes to recognize a loaf of bread, depending on whether or not the people in the study had been looking at the picture of the kitchen. So the context matters. We call that semantic priming. It's priming for meaning. So if you are priming somebody for a particular meaning, then they're more likely to perceive the thing that means something identical or belongs to the same realm as the initial stimulus did. So we know that context does improve perception. On the next slide is the example that we just talked about. All right, so expectations. So expectations and context are a little bit different. Context is about what is happening around you. Expectations is what you expect to happen around you. So expectations are based on what we believe to be true or what we predict to be true about a situation based on our memory and our knowledge of that event or that context. Okay. Now, when we think of what to expect, it is a reasonable thing to expect the world to behave in a certain way sometimes. But what's not okay is for us to believe that our expectations are infallible, that what we think should be true about the world should always be true about the world. In that way, our background knowledge and expectations can produce these biases in perception rather than improving them. There have been numerous studies that test expectations and leverage expectations about something. And one of the ways that you can test your expectations is by challenging what you believe to be true about something like going to college, and coupling that with your actual experience about going to college. So sometimes we think it's going to be a certain way and it's not. And what happens is that we get disappointed by the difference between our expectations and the reality. Well, it's because our expectations created a bias, that we think the world should behave a certain way. It didn't. It created unpredictability, and now we're upset by it. So there are biases that come along from that expectation. And the way that we counter that is by challenging what we expect and kind of looking at something with a fresh perspective rather than expecting something to be a certain way. Okay. The example from the book talks about, it's a very interesting thing. I remember talking about this when I was young, when we still had a record player and stuff. I'm not old enough to have experienced the first wave of records, but when record players were on the way out, we used to play records backwards, just kind of, turn on the turntable so that the needle was active, but so that the turntable wasn't. You can actually spin them backwards, and you can listen to a song backwards. And what we would try to do is we had a Talkboy, which is this thing. If you've seen the movie, which one was it? It was Home Alone 2. Home Alone 2, where he records things. We would spin records backwards, and then we would try to repeat what we heard. And then we would play it on our Talkboy, and then we would play that backwards in a cassette deck. Really nerdy stuff. We didn't have lots of other things to do in the winter. And we'd see how close we could get to it. And, we were sometimes, but not most of the time. But what these researchers did was they told people that there were satanic words in a rock song when they were played backwards. And that was actually one of the theories that were out there, was that all these rock songs, all these hard rock songs were hiding these subliminal messages in them. And they would say, oh, see, if you play this backwards, you can hear it. And I think that that Ozzy Osbourne had a couple of songs that were cited as having subliminal messages. I'm trying to think of a couple other ones, but that's one that's jumping out to me. And what would happen is that people would say, oh, yeah, I think that there are satanic messages, and here's what I think it's saying. And then a control group who wasn't told that these records had these satanic messages, they wouldn't perceive anything. And the reality is that there weren't any satanic messages, but for the people who expected them, they heard them. So in that case, they were able to demonstrate that the expectation led to the perception that there were satanic messages. Along with expectations goes perceptual misidentification, because perceptual misidentification is based on what we expect to be true about the world. What was curious about UFOs is that they weren't termed flying saucers until the mid-40s. Then after that, anybody who recalled seeing a UFO thought of them as flying saucers. So people are very suggestible in terms of how they go along with something based on their expectations. And what was interesting is that there was a book called The UFO Handbook, a guide to investigating, evaluating, and reporting UFO sightings. Alan Hendry wrote this book back in 1979, and these were some of the images that were mistaken for that were mistaken for UFOs. And really what they all come down to is that they're either airplanes or signs that people saw, and they thought that those were UFOs. So again, very reasonable explanation for these things, but if people believe that they're UFOs, then they're going to be biased in that, and they're going to have a lot of misidentification. Next are hallucinations. So these are kind of the things that people think of in terms of being odd or peculiar for people who have psychological issues. But hallucinations are a bit different than that, where we have things like illusions and other perceptual anomalies. Those are based on what we're experiencing externally. Hallucinations are generally in the absence of an external presence or external stimuli. Hallucinations are things that happen inside of our minds. It's an internal perceptual error. Okay. So it's a cognitive error. It's where people think that something is real, and the objective stimulus is absent. It's gone. There's nothing there. Okay. So what happens is that information that we have is stored, and when we retrieve it, it feels real to us. So a hallucination can be auditory, or it can be visual. You can also have something that you sense through touch. There have been cases of hallucinations where people have felt something like a cat running across their feet while they're sleeping, but there is nothing there. And they don't have a cat, so that makes it even weirder. But I think that people who have cats are weird too, so you're weird either way in my book. That's not kidding. I like cats. I just don't want one. I'm over having pets for a while. We've had the same pet for almost 20 years now. We love her, but you can't go on vacation or anything. Anyways, so there are lots of different types of hallucinations that one can have. Sometimes when people have different mental health disorders, they have hallucinations. Like people with schizophrenia will have hallucinations where they'll hear voices. They will believe things about them based on those voices. They believe the persecutions that the voices are having. Those are more delusional when you have an actual belief based on that, but they're still based on hallucinations generally. People who are grieving might have hallucinations, especially if, let's say that you've been married for a really long time and you've been living together with your spouse, and you get up in the morning and you expect them to be out like sitting in a chair watching TV or something, or eating breakfast or whatever, and you go out and you might have this glimpse that they're there, but they're actually not there. And by the way, this is different than like an illusion where there is something out there that you are misinterpreting. Again, this is based on no external information at all. It's all based on what's going on inside one's head. This kind of leads into what we'll talk about next with memory and memory errors and how we retrieve information and make sense of the world around us based on what we expect to happen. So you can kind of see how we're kind of building this idea that we have these biases, these expectations about the world, and based on our attention and the way that we can create this concerted vision of the world gets tricky, because that leads us into adapting more of a combination of the comprehensive bits of information we have about the world, and then if any one of those can be compromised through bias, then it could compromise the whole system. And we haven't even talked about memory yet, which we'll get into right now. So we have a couple different kinds of memory. And the first we'll start off with is what's called working memory. And I think that working memory is probably one of the misunderstood versions of memory. And when we think of working memory, we used to call this short-term memory. And we got away from short-term memory because it suggested that there is some kind of intermediary type of memory. Like there's working memory, then short-term memory, then long-term memory. But really, working memory and short-term memory are both very short. They're built of the rule of 5 plus or minus 2, meaning that we can remember about 5 bits of information plus or minus 2 at any given moment before it has to be rehearsed in some way and sent on to long-term memory. You'll learn a lot more about this in cognition. So what we know about working memory is that it's good for about 7 bits of information. So 7 bits of information is trying to remember something like 7 numbers or 7 items in a list or 7 words or whatever like that. And it's plus or minus 2, meaning that our working memory is pretty good at managing 5 to 9 bits of information at any one time. And one example of this is kind of like remembering a phone number, where you can remember a phone number because they're 7 digits long. But if you have to remember an area code that is that's not known to you, that can be a little trickier, because that puts that up into that 10 range, which is kind of just outside of that 7 plus or minus 2. The good news, by the way, is that we can also do what's called chunking, where we take 7 individual bits of information and break it down, like a phone number. It's easier to remember a phone number if it's this pattern that goes ... right? So that's a phone number, but it's 3 digits, then 4 digits, how we normally remember phone numbers. We can chunk it that way. Makes it a little bit easier. But generally, if we try to remember just, straight strings of numbers, it's a little bit trickier. Okay. So we can use working memory to do lots of different things, and it's just a temporary holding space before it gets sent on to long-term memory. So we can use it for problem solving, like determining if a street light is the right color to go, looking at traffic patterns if you're driving, figuring out how to manage your course schedule. So those are all examples that can happen in working memory, because those are things that you're constantly looking at, reminding yourself of. Reading, critical thinking can be working memory, about how you can recognize if you're making a cognitive error. Taking notes in class, just the amount of time that it takes to create a word and move on. So when you're doing things like just reading or just taking notes, that working memory is just, reading a word or writing down a word. You need to rehearse it before it's sorted into long-term memory. So don't think that just because you read something means that you're going to remember it. It's the first step, but you have to process it. Again, working memory is limited. It's the 5 to 9 rule, or the 7 plus or minus 2. It holds information for that short period of time, again, until we rehearse it. But it is incredibly prone to interference from other things. If you're trying to remember a phone number just by repeating it through straight rote rehearsal, and somebody interrupts you with something, you're going to forget. Or if you're counting something and somebody says something to you and distracts you, you're going to forget where you were. So Working memory is limited. It's full of interference. So it's what we call volatile memory, meaning that it's not good at memorizing. It's good for recognizing something, for processing bits of information quickly, but it needs to be rehearsed in order for it to be effectively learned. So what happens during working memory is that we have what's called cognitive load. When we try to process too much data at once, we forget. That might seem obvious to you, but that's how working memory works. It has to be rehearsed and processed in a way where it can be made into long-term memory. Okay? So again, when you are taking notes, if you're not fast enough, you might forget what somebody said because it's outside of that range of values that are easy to remember. So if you're trying to remember, a sentence that somebody said and they're moving on to the next thing and you're trying to listen to the next thing, something's going to fail. Either you're going to focus on the sentence and not hear what's being said, or you're going to focus on what's being said and not be able to finish writing down your sentence. So again, working memory, very volatile. You have to process that. And what happens is that we overestimate how well we can remember things in the short term, and it's not very long. And then with long-term memory, that's where we store all of our permanent memories. I say permanent, it's kind of in air quotes. We don't just remember everything as if it's a video recorder. Things have to be processed. So we don't just have like this reproducible memory. It's really a matter of whether or not we can take what we know and create this, what we call reconstruction of it. And that leads us into schema. So we reconstruct something from long-term memory based on the schema. And schema are general understandings of the way that something works. They're kind of like expectations in a way, but schemas are usually more general and they're about the structure of how things work. It's about how we integrate information. So we integrate information based on a schema. So if you're trying to think about, something that's going on in your family and somebody does something really stupid in your family and they get in trouble, you're like, well, I guess that kind of makes sense because that's how they behave, right? So you're kind of understanding that that's the way that somebody behaves, but it's also based on the expectations, so you're not surprised by it. Whereas if somebody does something out of the ordinary, you're like, oh, well, that's odd because ... It's odd really because you had a schema that was different, kind of based on the expectations that you had for them. But we reconstruct the bits of information that we have based on the context or the schema of the event that it occurs in. Let me give you an example. If I'm working in stats class and I am being asked to, what kind of statistical test would you use for a particular hypothesis? And we're talking about a test called ANOVA that week. Well, I am probably not going to say some other type of test like correlation because that's not what we're talking about. That's not part of the schema for the week. So I really have a limited amount of answers to give based on the context of the memory that I have to retrieve. So we oftentimes rely on these schemas in order to understand what decisions to make or how to problem solve. Same thing is like if you're here at the University of Olivet and somebody says, hey, where do you want to go for lunch? And you're like, well, we could go to McDonald's or we could go to Burger King or we could go to the KC. And someone's going to be like, well, we're just going to lunch. We don't have time to go to McDonald's or Burger King because those are not around us. It's like, well, okay. That the person who made the suggestion about going to Charlotte for lunch did not use the schema about where they were. They used a schema that said, oh, well, I can go to these other places for lunch. But the person who was asking the question had in mind their schema for what was available. Well, the schema was there's only things that are available within, walking distance and that we can eat within a half an hour. So people use schemas differently in order to draw bits of information about the world around them. Again, we reconstruct the world. We don't reproduce the world because we don't have that kind of memory. We have to use context in order to develop what our decisions will look like. And because our memory is based on what we can reconstruct, we oftentimes have false memories, especially about context. You might remember that you had a really good cheeseburger that one time. You're like, well, where was that? Well, I think it was Burger King. Well, no, it wasn't Burger King at all. It was at McDonald's, but you had this false memory because maybe it was the last place you went. Or maybe it's because you really like their fries and you assume that if they have good fries, they have good burgers. Okay. So you can have a false memory. These are people have talked about false memories an awful lot, especially around things like 9/11 or even COVID, where you remember things incorrectly. Kind of related to false memories is source forgetting, where you forget what the source of something was. And again, it's not always necessary that you forget what the source was, is that you misattribute it. Where if you're trying to remember what somebody said, and you're like, well, it sounds like that John would have said that, so I think John said it. Well, no, it wasn't John at all. It was somebody else, but because you have a schema for John and the things that he would say, you attributed it to John. So it's kind of a false memory, but it's a false memory not for what was actually said, but for who said it, for whom said it. Yeah. All right, and last thing we're going to wrap up with here is ordinary memory and how accurate it might be. In a study, people are able to recognize 40,000 different words and 93% of over 2,500 pictures that were viewed 3 days earlier. So it's pretty accurate. That's for recognition, being able to recognize. Recall is different. No, you couldn't recall 40,000 words, but you can recognize if you saw 40,000 different words and over 2,500 pictures. Okay. There's actually a test out there called the test of memory malingering, where there's a battery of tests that you go through, and you look at different images, and you have to score within a certain range to where people think that you have adequate memory and that you're not malingering, like you're trying to say that you don't remember things. And what the basis of that research is the same as the basis for that first example, is that people have incredibly good ordinary memory recognition, where they can recognize things quite well. Recall is different, which is why eyewitness testimony is problematic. But also, it's problematic for eyewitnesses because sometimes we come up with a schema that interferes. So if you have two things that look alike, then recognition can be compromised. So recognition is good for most things, but when you have two things that interfere, or in the case of inattentional blindness, if you look at something and you don't recognize something else that's happening, or in the case of change blindness, where you don't recognize when a stimulus has changed, it can be inaccurate. So generally pretty good, but if there are other cognitive errors in place, it can be compromised. So we have to always be checking what we recognize and what we believe to be true. Because remember, of the 2,500 plus pictures, 93% accuracy, which means that there's still a certain amount of them, probably about 200 or so, that were not recognized accurately. Okay. We can also use tricks like mnemonics. Maybe you've used a mnemonic before where you try to remember something. One of the more common mnemonics, I think, is trying to remember the planet order. And the one that I used back when Pluto was a planet was my very energetic mother just served us 9 pancakes. So now you would say my very energetic mother just served us nothing. That's not as nice as pancakes, but whatever. Dang it, Pluto. Dwarf planet, I think is what it's called now, so it doesn't make the mnemonic. So through mnemonics and through using context, people can remember lots of things. The example here is that actors can recall hundreds of lines that they know because there's a context to it, or they use mnemonics. One of the coolest ways to remember things, I think, is called the method of loci, L-O-C-I. And that was a way for Greek orators to be able to remember what they were going to say by walking around like a house or something and reciting their oration. And then when they were actually giving their oration, they would remember where they were in the house when they were saying it. That would help them remember. Pretty cool stuff. So there are lots of different tricks that you could use in order to do that. All right, so that's it for Chapter 6. Again, there is a bit at the end about eyewitness testimony. I encourage you to read that on your own. It's a good application for some of the things that we talked about here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing what you can do with this new information.